So Alexander the Great, what do we know about Alexander? He was great. Yep. He named a lot of cities after himself. He named a city after his dog. He named a city after his horse. He died, though. Yeah. And that's when it really fell apart. But we're not totally sure, but we think it was a combination of heavy drinking and an injury that got infected. And he actually tried to commit suicide, and he was caught. So he was apparently in a bad condition for quite a while in Babylon. Very interesting. And then there's a whole mystery surrounding his body. Like, where did his body go? We know it was stolen by one of his generals who eventually ruled Egypt, Ptolemy. But there's so much amazing stuff about Alexander. He's very widely studied, but there are also many just things that happen with Alexander that make it sound like there's something supernatural going on in the background. I won't have time to explain it all, but Alexander is such an anomaly. There's so many legends around and so many feats that he accomplished that should not have been able to be accomplished by one person. It's just insane. The mole to Tyre? Is what you're talking about? Yeah. It's mentioned in the Old Testament, actually. The Jews very much paid attention to Alexander the Great. They compared him to Cyrus the Great. Alexander the Great would compare himself to Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire. But he would not compare himself to other Persian emperors, only Cyrus, because he was truly a great, one-of-a-kind emperor. And Alexander considered him a one-of-a-kind as well. This is a symbol of Macedon. So Macedonia, even today on their flag, carries this symbol of that star. This is a famous mosaic where we have a profile of Alexander. There are many busts and headpieces of Alexander. This is old mosaic, still intact, very ancient. This is an image of one of his first major battles against the Persians at River Granicus, where he was outnumbered. He was going uphill across a river. He should not have been able to win, but he did. Pretty crazy what he got away with. The Greco-Persian Wars, we already know about that. We know that the Greco-Persian Wars militarized the Greeks. The Greeks are very concerned with the Persians and creating stronger states. They even fight each other as they get more and more powerful in Greece. And so we already have a huge buildup. And this is before Alexander. We already have a huge buildup in militarization and the idea of the Greeks aligning against the Persians. Now, Philip of the Macedon, he's the key to Alexander's defeat of the Persians. And he's also the key to the alliance of Greece, where all of Greece comes together and they attack the Persians. They free up the Ionian coast of Turkey away from Persian rule. It was Alexander's father that made all this possible, Philip. Without Philip, there's no Alexander, literally, of course, because he was his father. But also, Alexander would not have defeated the Persians. Probably wouldn't have even fought the Persians if it wasn't for the genius Philip. Alexander gets the credit. Philip is largely forgotten. It should not be. It's Philip of Macedon who made military innovations to make the Macedonians the most powerful. He invented the sarissa. It's an extra long spear. Very long spear. As you can see here, it extends way out in front of the body. Not like a normal hoplite spear, which is, fairly long. These are almost double the length of a hoplite spear. What does that mean? What advantage does that give you? There are two. Real basic ones, at least. More distance. But the advantage with the sarissa is, remember what I said with hoplite warfare? When you have spears and everybody's tightly packed together, you have 3 or 4 spear tips in front of you. The guy behind you actually has his spear tip in front of you, and the guy behind him has his spear tip in front of you, the front line. With the sarissa, because it's longer, you get more spear tips in front. You get like triple the amount of spear tips in front. So it's much more difficult, not only for men, but horses to get through. Wall of spears, yeah, and mobile, highly mobile. These were a highly trained unit. They were like Spartans. They were full-time soldiers. So by the time Macedonia came along and started messing things up, they had already learned the lessons of the past. They had learned from the Spartans. They had learned from Thebes. And Philip was actually a royal hostage of a powerful city known as Thebes, who after the Greco-Persian Wars actually became more powerful than Sparta. They came up with an infantry unit that was the most feared infantry unit, even more feared than the Spartans, known as the Sacred Band. So if you ever start a band, maybe consider calling it that. But the Sacred Band was very unique. Anyone know why? The Sacred Band was unique. But they were essentially a diagonal column of men, infantry, and it was just 2 men next to each other, and then in a diagonal row repeating placements of 2 men. And the trick is not only were they elite soldiers, and it was a diagonal row, basically, it was difficult for them to be flanked because they traveled in a diagonal fashion. Also, one of the tricks is, Theban stuff that was rather clever, is that all the men were male lovers. So the man you were next to was your male lover.
They were all gay?
They were gay. So you'd have homosexual lovers, another group of homosexual lovers, another group, and then you have a disco. And that's the sacred band. The sacred band was the most feared. And what's interesting is Thebes revolted against Macedonia. Philip made all these military innovations, and he eventually got to where he conquered all his Greek enemies. He unified Macedonia and the barbarians that are around Macedonia, and basically created the Corinthian League, which was a way for him to create like a puppet government so he could lead all of Greece. So Philip is essentially, in a way, is like a king of Greece, even though he's not, The Macedonians did still have kings. Greeks didn't consider them Greek, but they spoke a dialect of Greek, so therefore they were kind of Greek. They were just northern mountaineer rednecks in a way, is the way Greeks thought of them. And so Philip was the one that made all this happen. As Alexander's growing older, when he's still young, he's getting more and more famous for weird things happening. There's a rumor going around that his mother slept with a snake, and that's how he was born. He gets into all these arguments with Philip, and Alexander tend not to get along. Alexander even runs away, Philip exiles all of Alexander's close friends for stirring him up. Very interesting things happened, but around age 14, there was what do they call it? An auction. There was an auction of horses, even. Philip and his comrades, Alexander was there, and they were just looking at horses. What horses do we want to buy for the army? What great horses can we get? And so you had all these sellers coming in. And this is the story of how Alexander found his horse, Bucephalus, the most famous horse in history. The handler of Bucephalus was charging way too much for this horse. It was a very large horse. Bucephalus means ox head. His head looks like an ox. It was like he must have had this huge cranium. When you see a horse head, they usually look like horses. Not an ox. But he was a very muscular but very aggressive horse. And the handler couldn't even keep control of this horse. So Philip and his generals were making fun of the horse, especially considered it was so overpriced. And so Alexander came out from the stand and ridiculed the men and said they don't understand a fine horse like this horse. And what Alexander noticed is that the horse was actually afraid of its own shadow. And horses are kind of weird. They get skittish about some really weird things. Like, especially an untrained horse, but also some trained horses. If they hear something rustling behind them in the leaves, they think it's a snake, And so they'll bolt. And if they have a rider on top, they might even knock you off, But horses just get startled. They're not predatorial. They're actually, that startle reflex is for survival. So Alexander noticed this, and so he directed the horse to face the sun. So there's no shadow. He didn't see his shadow. And so he jumped on top of the horse and went riding on it and amazed everyone. So that was one of his first feats as a youth. His second feat is his father was away at war, and Alexander got to kind of sit on the throne and be in the throne room, not really call the shots, but there was a Persian emissary. And the Persians were there, and Alexander, even though he was very, very young, he was asking them very, very intelligent questions. And the Persians were really impressed by this, and this was something that was remembered at court. When Alexander got older, he led a cavalry unit. And when Thebes revolted, the most powerful city-state in Greece, Thebes was destroyed by Philip and Alexander. Alexander was the one who destroyed the sacred band, the most feared infantry unit. He did this atop his horses. He was big. Alexander was more into cavalry units and lightning campaigns than infantry. What's interesting, though, is Philip is basically already preparing to destroy the Persians. He's raising this huge Greek alliance and getting all these Macedonians together. He already has a huge unit over in Turkey to get ready to attack the Persians. I mean, if he was assassinated pretty much right before he was getting ready to fight the Persians. How ironic. That's when Alexander stepped in and then did it. It would have been Philip the Great. It's just Philip was assassinated and Alexander stepped in. But now we say Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great now has the opportunity to be more famous than Philip, even though Philip did all the back work. It's a big mystery. I tend to think that Alexander and his mother had something to do with it. I mean, this was his opportunity, you know. Well, see, Philip had just married a Macedonian noblewoman, and they had a child, and it was a male. And Alexander's mother was not from Macedonia, so it was a threat to his reign. So then, more than any other time, Alexander felt a threat to his legacy. And Philip was getting ready to attack the Persians. Perfect time to assassinate Philip and take over before that boy grows too old and becomes the king regent, you know. I mean, it points to him a little bit, but then there's some other data to look at. Pausanias, the assassin. We know who the assassin was. When he killed Philip and ran to his horse, there were 2 horses waiting. That's kind of weird. Here's something else. Pausanias is the ex-lover of Philip. He's one of his generals, but an ex-lover. And Pausanias was brutally gang raped by another general. And like other infantry officers were taking turns on him and that sort of thing. And he was really upset about this. And so when he told Philip about it, Philip wouldn't do anything about it. So that gives Pausanias incentive to assassinate Philip. So it's like, oh my God, there's so many great options to choose. You know, what was the motive? So it's pretty complex. So it's difficult to really decide. But so Philip is assassinated. Alexander can come in and rush into Turkey, which he does. Battle of Granicus, he takes out the Persians for the first time, frees all of the Ionian cities, restores the Temple of Apollo, does these amazing things. He'll go into a city and restore temples and, you know, bring the gods back to the temples, they would say. Spend lots of money to redevelop these Ionian cities. Alexander spends a lot of money building Hellenistic cities. He starts the Hellenistic era. His death is the end of the classical era. The moment he dies, the classical era ends and the Hellenistic begins. The Hellenistic is a remnant of what Alexander left behind. His generals take over and divide up all his territory and create war with each other. That's the Hellenistic era. It's the shadow of Alexander. And so what's happening in the Hellenistic era and with Alexander, he's going out to the Mesopotamia and India and setting up Greek-like cities. People are learning Greek. People administer their city in Greek. People use Greek coins. You know, people start speaking in Greek. As far as, you know, Mesopotamia and even in barbarian lands north of that. What's interesting, after Alexander frees the Ionian coast, before he officially destroys the Persians, he goes into Egypt. Does anybody know what he does in Egypt? He becomes a god. Alexander has an interesting story. I already told you the one about his mother being impregnated by a snake. Well, there are multiple gods who would transform into a snake and impregnate women. One being Zeus, the other one being Dionysus. And originally in the legend, because his mother was a priestess of Dionysus, and she was a snake handler because of her Dionysus cult, people assumed that if he was going to claim a mythological father, it would be Dionysus. Well, instead, he goes to Egypt, just outside of Egypt, to the oracle of Siwah, the oracle of Ammon at Siwah. And Ammon is like Zeus, Ammon-Ra, Egyptian version of Zeus. And it's an oracle. So Alexander goes into the oracle, and he wants them to tell him his destiny. This is the most respected oracle in the world at the time, in the known world. The oracle at Delphi is great, but this one is like the most ancient, because the Greeks consider the Egyptians a highly spiritual and sort of rooted in a religiosity that maybe is a little deeper than their own. They have a certain weird respect. It's almost like some people do have respect for like Chinese wisdom. They're so wise. I love their philosophers. For some reason, I just like them more than, say, Western philosophers. You know, a lot of people are like that. But he goes to the oracle, and the oracle tells him that he is his son. So and Alexander is the only one who hears this. But he tells everybody what the oracle said once he leaves. And so from then on, Alexander begins spreading the message through his historians, his court poets. There are hundreds of poets that follow him around. He holds contests, athletic games and poetry contests where you can gain great fame and notoriety just by following Alexander's army. You know, anytime Alexander wants to hold a contest, he'll do it. And so you have all these poets who are spreading the word. Alexander is a god. It's revealed. He's the son of Zeus Ammon. In a way, he can disassociate from Philip, who really made it all happen, right? And say that he's a god. Well, it's kind of important to be a god if you're going to rule over multiple peoples. Kind of like the Persians were. A lot of people consider them almost godlike, like you saw in the movie 300. It helps to be a demigod or a full god if you're going to have a large empire. Alexander eventually defeats Persia, becomes the lord of Asia. So that actually brings the downfall of the Persians. So in that question, how did they militarize the Greeks with the Greco-Persian Wars, and how did they bring their own downfall? Well, through the alliance of the Greeks and the designs of Philip and Alexander. And results in the Hellenization of the Near East, parts of India. Alexander has a huge effect in these areas. There are pockets of cultures, like in Pakistan, who claim to be descendants of Alexander and his troops, who stayed there, or who camped there, or whatever. So, various parts of the world in the Middle East, there are still oral traditions about Alexander. And the classical era ends at the moment of his death, in 323. Hellenistic era begins. So my question for you guys is, how did Philip of Macedon make many of Alexander's successes possible?